Tonight, we journey far beyond the usual paths of history, the grand coronations, the shining swords, the romantic tales of castles and kings. We turn away from the feasts and the ballads. Instead, we walk softly down shadowed staircases, into the cold, quiet belly of the medieval world. Into the places history rarely lights, the punishment chambers, the courtrooms of judgment, the long corridors where silence itself was used as a tool. Close your eyes now, and imagine a different kind of past. You are inside a castle, but not in the Great Hall. Here, the air is cooler, heavy with damp and dust. The only light flickers from torches mounted along the walls, casting shadows that move like ghosts along the stone. You hear a distant drip, drip, drip. Is it water? Is it something else? No one speaks here. No one dares. This is not a tale meant to frighten. It is not horror. This is history, told gently. A soft retelling of hard truths. For those who find peace in forgotten corners, who rest best among echoes and ancient stories, this is your place. Together, we will explore the systems that govern justice in medieval Europe, not with judgment, but with understanding. We'll walk through the rituals, the beliefs, and yes, the tools of punishment. But we will not linger on gore or cruelty. Instead, we will see the meaning behind the madness, the order behind the iron, the purpose that pain once served. Because justice, in the Middle Ages, was not just punishment, it was performance. It was spiritual. It was communal. It was sometimes terrifying, but always meaningful to those who lived it. We'll dispel some myths too. The Iron Maiden, for example, one of the most famous symbols of torture, was never actually used during the medieval period. It's more theatre than truth, more fiction than fact. In that gap between myth and memory, we'll find the real stories, ones far more haunting and far more human. So settle in, let your breathing slow, let your body grow heavy with rest, let your mind drift through the soft dark of time. We begin not with the blades or chains, but with belief. Because before any instrument was forged, before any sentence was spoken, there was an idea of justice. And that idea was powerful enough to shape centuries. Let's go back now, together to the world of medieval law. The framework of fear. To understand how punishment worked, we must first understand what people feared, and what they believed. Imagine living in the 12th or 13th century. You are a farmer, or a blacksmith, or a midwife. The church is not just a building on Sunday. It is the air you breathe. Sin is not a private matter. It is a social concern. Your soul is always under watch, both by God and by your neighbors. And crime? It is not only a disruption of peace, it is a tear in the spiritual fabric of your community. To commit a crime is to invite divine wrath, not just on yourself, but on your entire village. Justice, then, is not only about fairness, it is about restoration. A way to make things right with the divine and with the people. That's why so much of medieval justice was theatrical. It had to be visible, it had to be understood, and sometimes, it had to be feared. Trial by ordeal. Let's start with one of the most infamous concepts, trial by ordeal. If two people were accused of a crime, or if no clear evidence could be found, the church sometimes called for divine judgment. This wasn't meant to be cruel. It was believed that God would literally reveal the truth by protecting the innocent. Imagine this scene. You've been accused of theft. You know you're innocent, but you have no witnesses. The priest gathers the townsfolk in the churchyard. A cauldron of water is set to boil over a fire. Prayers are spoken. A cross is raised. You are told to plunge your hand into the boiling water. You must retrieve a stone from the bottom. Now picture the sting, the pain. You do it, because you must. Then, you are wrapped in clean linen. You wait 3 days. After that, a priest unwraps your hand. If it is healing cleanly, you are innocent. If it is festering, you are guilty. There were other types of ordeal too. Walking across red-hot plowshares, carrying a bar of iron, or being bound and tossed into water. It sounds terrible now. But in that time it was considered fair. God would protect the blameless. To endure suffering without injury was to prove one's purity. To us it feels brutal. But to them it was divine logic. Secular versus church courts. Justice was not always delivered by the same hands. There were two main systems, church courts and secular courts. Church courts dealt with matters of morality, clergy, and penance. These trials were held in cathedrals, or abbeys. Picture quiet halls, long wooden benches, flickering candlelight on polished stone. The punishments in church courts were rarely physical. Instead, they might order fasting, pilgrimage, or public confession. A man caught stealing from the church might be told to walk barefoot to a holy shrine, wearing sackcloth and ashes. But the secular courts, those were very different. Presided over by a local lord, sheriff, or king's official, these courts dealt with violence, property, and rebellion. Their punishments had to be seen. They were often held in open air, on hills, in courtyards, or market squares. Imagine standing before a crowd, your crime shouted aloud, your sentence immediate. There were no defense attorneys, little formal evidence, confession was key, and when confession could not be obtained, pressure, of various kinds, might be applied. The mood of the courtroom. Medieval courtrooms weren't quiet places of solemn order, they were noisy, full of spectators, gossip, and opinion. In many villages, the entire community attended court days. It was part entertainment, part warning, part civic duty. People jeered, they clapped, they whispered to one another. The fate of the accused became everyone's business. Justice was participatory. And while it may seem barbaric now, it had one strange advantage: transparency. Everyone knew what was happening. Punishments were not hidden. Crimes were known. Accountability, flawed as it was communal. Punishment as a tool of order. It's important to understand. Medieval justice wasn't just about revenge, it was about order. Punishment was designed to restore balance. A thief disrupted peace, so his suffering re-established it. A murderer shed blood, so his own blood was seen. A liar spread danger, so she was made an example. Each punishment was symbolic, deliberate, rooted in religious, cultural, and political ideas about the body, the soul, and society. It wasn't about cruelty for its own sake. It was about reminding everyone, there are rules, there is a structure, there is a force greater than any one man. A world of ritual and symbolism. Even the tools used were steeped in ritual. Judges carried staffs or seals. Priests blessed trials. Executions began with prayers. Trials opened with oaths sworn on holy books or relics. Everything had meaning. And this is what made medieval punishment so haunting. Not just its harshness, but its intentionality. Every act was meant to signal, teach, or warn. Every sentence echoed through community memory. As we leave the courtroom now, stepping back into the chill of night, we begin to hear the sounds of preparation, the creak of wood, the tightening of rope, the hiss of fire. These were not tools of impulse, they were instruments of justice, and in the next section, we'll explore them one by one. As we move deeper into the medieval world of justice, we now come face to face with its tools. Objects not born from chaos, but from order, from necessity, from belief. Each device had a purpose. Not always to harm, but always to remind. Each creak of wood, each clang of iron, each echo in a stone chamber, was meant to do more than punish. It was meant to speak. Tonight, we walk through these instruments not in fear, but in understanding. We see what they meant, how they were used, and the world they helped shape. Let's begin with the most infamous, the rack. Precision in pain. Imagine a long wooden frame, two sturdy rollers at either end, with thick ropes attached to each. The person is laid out, arms and legs bound, body stretched taut. Then, slowly, methodically, the rollers turn. With each crank, the tension increases. Not in wild jerks, but in careful mechanical inches. The rack was not used for random cruelty, it was a tool of extraction, to draw out confessions, names, or secrets. Most commonly, it was used in cases of treason, conspiracy, or heresy, matters where the crown or church believed vital information was being hidden. Picture a suspect refusing to speak. A noble accused of plotting rebellion, a religious dissenter suspected of recruiting others. The rack was not the first step, but the final one, when persuasion had failed. In England, it was known as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, named after a 15th-century official who supposedly favored its use. But records show that its appearance was rare and regulated. In most cases, official permission had to be obtained from a monarch or royal council. This was not justice gone mad. It was justice engineered, and though its use was precise, the damage was profound. The human body, so delicate, so full of sinew and joint, was not made for that kind of tension. Shoulders popped, ligaments tore, limbs lengthened unnaturally. But perhaps more powerful than the pain was the symbolism. The rack made people see the state could reach inside you, not just for blood, but for truth. The pillory shame made visible. Now let us leave the cold chamber and walk out into the town square. The sun is high. Children play. Merchants shout. And in the center a wooden structure. The pillory. It stood about shoulder height, with a hinged wooden board at the top. 3 holes, 1 for the neck, 2 for the hands. The accused would be placed inside, locked in position for all to see. Unlike the rack, the pillory did not seek confession. It delivered humiliation. Used for crimes like fraud, perjury, slander, or dishonesty in trade, the pillory turned the crowd into judge and punisher. People threw rotten food, mud, sometimes stones. They jeered, they laughed, they sometimes grew cruel. But beneath the mockery was a message. Dishonesty will be exposed. Punishment in the pillory could last hours, or days. Rain or shine. The trapped person could not move, could not scratch their nose, could not wipe away tears, and when it ended, the punishment often followed them. Reputation was vital in medieval society. Once a person had stood in the pillory, their trust was fractured, their name remembered. This was not torture of the body, but of the spirit, and that made it no less powerful. The stocks, stillness as sentence. At first glance the stocks may seem similar to the pillory, another wooden frame, another immobilization device, but the stocks targeted the lower body, typically the ankles, and sometimes the wrists as well. They were usually placed on a bench or platform in a public area. The condemned sat, legs locked in place, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. Used for minor offenses, drunkenness, rowdiness, petty theft. The stocks were less about pain, more about inconvenience and ridicule, but imagine the discomfort. No ability to stretch or shift. No shelter from weather. Insects crawling, legs cramping, and passers-by stopping to stare, or worse, taunt. It was a punishment designed to waste your time and remind others of your failure. And even when it was over, the image stayed. You in the stocks, publicly displayed like a broken cog in the machine. Justice here wasn't about hurting you. It was about freezing you, turning you into a living warning. The ducking stool, punishment for women. Of all the tools used in medieval and early modern justice, few were more gendered than the ducking stool. Used almost exclusively on women, particularly those labeled scolds, nags, or suspected witches. The ducking stool was a long wooden arm mounted over a river or pond. At the end, a chair. The accused was tied into the seat, then slowly lowered into the water, submerged, raised, then dunked again. Sometimes the water was cold, sometimes filthy. The crowd gathered, they cheered. It was a spectacle. And though most ducking events did not result in death, they were not harmless. Women could suffer shock, exposure, injury, or worse if the rope slipped or the water was deep. More than the physical threat, though, was the humiliation. The ducking stool said, "Your voice is a problem. Your defiance must be drowned." It was not just punishment. It was performance, a reinforcement of social roles, gender norms, and the power of communal shame. The scold's bridle, a muzzle for the mind. Let's stay with another tool used primarily on women. The scold's bridle, sometimes called the brank, was a metal mask or cage fitted around the head, with a small plate that pressed down on the tongue. It didn't break bones, but it silenced. Used for women accused of gossiping, insulting neighbors, or speaking out, the bridle turned their own mouths into weapons. The effect was eerie. Imagine walking through your town, everyone staring, children pointing, no words allowed, breath growing short, your tongue aching. Some bridles even had bells attached, so people could hear the approach of the scold. Again, this was not hidden violence, it was public correction. It said, "Your words are dangerous. Your silence is safer." How many women bore this punishment? We'll never know. Many cases were never recorded, but the tool itself survives, in museums, in illustrations, in whispers. It reminds us that justice often targeted not just the body, but the voice, the breaking wheel, the edge of pain. Now we return to something more brutal. The breaking wheel, sometimes called the Catherine wheel, was used in the harshest cases: murder, treason, banditry. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel. Then, with iron bars or heavy hammers, their limbs were broken, one by one, between the spokes. It was a slow, agonizing process. And it was often public. Sometimes, the body was left on the wheel afterward, displayed on a hill or crossroads, left to rot, as a warning to others. It was not common. But it was feared. Because this was not correction. This was erasure. A person broken so completely, they could not return to society, even in death. Hanging cages. Bodies left behind. In some cities and castles, metal cages were suspended high above gates or gallows. These were not used for torture but for display. After execution, the bodies of criminals, especially traitors, might be placed inside these cages and left to hang. Day after day, week after week, they were symbols, not of punishment, but of permanence. They said, "This is what happens to those who defy the crown." Even birds pecking at the remains became part of the message. And as people passed below, they looked up, and remembered. Thumbscrews, iron boots, and more. There were many other tools. Some used sparingly, some never at all. Thumbscrews, small clamps that crushed fingers slowly, turning confession into pain. The iron boot, heated or tightened around the foot until bones cracked. The heretic's fork, a double-pointed collar that kept the head from moving, forcing stillness. Many of these devices were regional. Rare. Sometimes symbolic more than practical. Some may have been used only once. Others may never have left the imagination of those who feared them. But in a world where fear was currency, even imagined devices could have real effects. The message behind the metal. As we leave this hall of instruments, take with you one thought. These were not just tools of harm, they were tools of communication. Each one said something. To the accused, to the crowd, to the future. The rack whispered, "You will speak." The pillory shouted, "This person lied." The ducking stool sang, "She stepped out of line." The breaking wheels screamed, "This soul is gone." And in that symphony of punishment, a society found structure. As we move on, we will step away from the metal and into the lives that encountered it, because every device had a story, and every sentence a face. Behind every device, every sentence, and every scream was a person. Tonight we step away from the mechanisms of pain and into the lives that encountered them. Real people. Some famous, most forgotten, all of them trapped, in one way or another, in the gears of medieval justice. We will not linger on their suffering. We will not recreate their pain. Instead, we will witness them softly, gently, as echoes in time. Let's begin with a woman whose crime was speaking. Marjorie Baxter, the midwife heretic. In 15th century Norwich, England, lived a woman named Marjorie Baxter. She was not a queen or noble. She was a midwife, a wife, a mother, a woman who whispered different truths. Marjorie belonged to a religious movement known as the Lollards, followers of the theologian John Wycliffe, who preached that people should read the Bible for themselves, in their own language, that they could speak to God without a priest. To the church this was dangerous, heresy. Marjorie did not keep her beliefs secret. She spoke openly. She challenged priests. She gathered women and read aloud the scriptures in English. She questioned indulgences and relics. She suggested that confession to God was more powerful than confession to a man. Imagine her standing in a narrow alley, teaching quietly, children nearby, neighbors listening with cautious ears. Eventually she was accused. Her punishment was public penance. She was forced to stand in a marketplace, holding a large candle, wearing a paper crown marked heretic, a spectacle not meant to harm her flesh, but to brand her name. No rack, no fire, just shame, isolation, watching eyes. Yet she returned to her work. Marjorie Baxter reminds us that silence was often the goal, not destruction, but containment. Her story echoes through centuries, showing how justice was used to manage not only crime, but ideas. Eleanor Cobham, the Silent Duchess. Now let us step into higher halls. Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, was a powerful noblewoman in the early 1400s. Educated, ambitious, influential, too influential. She was married to Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the heir presumptive to the throne of England. But Eleanor's presence in court, her closeness to scholars and astrologers, made people uneasy. In 1441, she was accused of using sorcery to predict, and perhaps hasten, the death of King Henry VI. Whether she believed in astrology or not, we do not fully know. But her crime, officially, was consulting astrologers and necromancers. Her real crime may have been having too much voice. Eleanor's trial was a spectacle. The court needed to make an example of her. Her sentence was not death, but erasure. She was forced to walk barefoot through the streets of London, holding a taper. Her titles were stripped, her lands taken. She was imprisoned in solitary religious houses, first at Chester, Then on the Isle of Man. No chains, no flames, just silence. A life confined, not by bars, but by history's forgetfulness. Eleanor lived for over 30 more years. Alone. She reminds us that sometimes, punishment came not in screams, but in absence. The peasant in the stock's anonymous suffering. Now shift your gaze to a quieter village. One without court intrigue. No royal banners. Just cobblestone paths and low, thatched roofs. A man sits in the stocks, his feet and wrists are locked in place. He has been there since morning. Children pass by and giggle. An old woman spits near him. Someone throws an apple core. His name is not written in any book. His crime, perhaps, was stealing bread. Or being drunk. Or speaking too sharply to a steward. We'll never know. But he sat in those stocks because someone saw disorder in him, and decided to make it visible. This was the most common face of medieval punishment, the ordinary person made into a warning. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were seen. Alice Taylor, the scold in the bridle. Now let us visit the year 1567, in the town of Faversham, England. A woman named Alice Taylor was placed in the scold's bridle. She was accused of slandering her neighbors, of gossip, of speaking too boldly, of being too much in a world where women were asked to be less. The bridle was made of iron. It fit over her head and jaw, and had a small flat plate that pressed against her tongue, holding it down. She could not speak, she could barely swallow. Some bridles had spikes, but Alice's likely did not. It didn't need to, she walked through the town with it on. The punishment wasn't meant to change her, it was meant to expose her, to show others what happens to women who speak in the wrong direction. Alice disappears from records after that. But for that one day, she became the embodiment of fear made into metal. Her story is important, because it shows us that medieval punishment wasn't always about what you did, but about who you were allowed to be. John the Miller. Tried by water, John the Miller was accused of theft in a small Yorkshire town in the late 1200s. No one could prove it, but the rumour was strong. He denied it, so they used trial by cold water. He was tied with a rope around his waist and lowered into a pond. The theory was this: water, being pure, would accept the innocent, but the guilty would float, rejected by nature itself. John floated. He was declared guilty. His punishment was branding, a mark on the cheek or hand. A letter burned into his flesh, so wherever he went, others would know. We do not know what happened to him after that. But imagine trying to buy bread or ask for shelter with that mark on your face. The punishment didn't end when the fire cooled, it followed him. And still, we remember nothing else about him, only that he floated. Joan of Arc, the martyr on trial. And now perhaps the most famous story of medieval justice, Joan of Arc. A teenage girl from Domremy, France, illiterate, devout, filled with visions. She claimed that saints spoke to her, that God had chosen her to lead France against English rule. And she did. She rallied armies, lifted sieges, crowned a king. But in 1430 she was captured. And in 1431, put on trial by an ecclesiastical court in Rouen, under English oversight. Her charges? Heresy, cross-dressing, claiming divine revelation. The trial was long, filled with traps and contradictions. She stood alone, against a room of scholars, and still she spoke clearly. They found her guilty. She was burned at the stake in the marketplace. The fire did not just take her body, it tried to destroy her meaning, but it failed. Joan of Arc became a saint, a symbol, a defiance that punishment could not erase. Her story reminds us that sometimes, the ones punished most severely are the ones who scare the powerful. Unseen and forgotten, the majority. For every Eleanor or Joan, there were thousands more whose names are lost. Women who were ducked for speaking out in anger after their husbands were unfaithful. Men who were beaten for poaching rabbits on noble land to feed their children. Children locked in stocks for playing games on the Sabbath. They were not part of grand history. But they were part of real history. They were judged, watched and punished by a system designed not only to control, but to remember. Yet we forgot them. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine them not in pain, but in peace. Picture the woman walking home after the pillory, head held high. The man whose branding fades into a scar. The girl who survives the ducking and tells her daughter never to bow her voice. Let them rest. Let their stories drift quietly across the centuries. They were people. Not props in a tale. and they deserve to be seen again. As we float further through time, we enter a realm where history begins to blur, where the truth wears the costume of legend, and fear becomes entertainment. The medieval era, often called the Dark Ages, has long suffered from misunderstanding. Over the centuries, the punishments of the time have been exaggerated, dramatized, even invented. Tonight, in soft tones, we will untangle some of the most enduring myths surrounding medieval torture, not to scold the stories, but to understand where they came from and what they obscure. Let us move gently through shadow and see what remains when the dust of exaggeration settles. The Iron Maiden, a 19th century invention. Picture this: a tall, human-shaped metal coffin, its doors lined with sharp iron spikes, a person placed inside. The doors closed slowly. The spikes pierce. Not deep enough to kill, but enough to cause agony. The victim bleeds, screams, and slowly dies. It's one of the most iconic images of medieval torture. And yet, it never existed, at least not in the Middle Ages. The Iron Maiden, as we know it, was a product of the 18th and 19th centuries. The most famous one, the so-called Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was constructed in the 1800s, using parts from older artifacts to create a terrifying museum piece. There is no reliable historical evidence of Iron Maidens being used in medieval Europe. No court records, no trial mentions, no eyewitnesses. Why then do we believe in it? Because it's effective. The imagery is so powerful, so perfect, that it imprints itself into the imagination. The Victorians, fascinated by tales of grim medieval cruelty, helped spread the myth. They placed Iron Maidens in museums, printed illustrations in books, and let horror fill in the gaps. And so, a lie became a legend. The pair of anguish, probably never used. Another common tale tells of a metal object, shaped like a flower bud, inserted into the mouth, or worse, and slowly cranked open. It was called the pair of anguish. According to popular stories, it was used on heretics, liars, or unfaithful women. Sometimes, it's said to have been used on accused witches. But here again, the historical record is silent. Physical examples of these objects do exist in some collections, but their origin and purpose are unclear. No medieval trial mentions them. No sketches from the era show them in use. No laws describe them. Some historians believe they were created later, perhaps for display, or even as hoaxes. Others suggest they may have had symbolic or theatrical purposes, not actual punitive use. Regardless, the pair has become a symbol of medieval brutality, despite little evidence it was ever used. The myth persists because it makes us shiver. The brazen bull, the Judas cradle, and other horrors. There are other tales, some rooted in ancient Greece, others falsely attributed to the Middle Ages. The brazen bull, supposedly a metal bull that roasted victims alive inside. The Judas cradle, where a victim was suspended over a pyramid-shaped seat. The sawing torture, where a person was hung upside down and sawed in half. Gruesome, graphic, but again, little or no medieval evidence. Many of these devices appear more frequently in Renaissance curiosity collections and Enlightenment critiques of barbarism than they do in authentic medieval court records. That's not to say medieval people were gentle, but the most outrageous torture devices, often imagined, or very rare, or misattributed. Medieval dungeons. More holding cell than horror house. Now, let us descend a stone staircase. A dungeon perhaps. The kind you've seen in films. Dim, filthy, with chains on the walls and bones on the floor. The word dungeon today conjures horror, screams, rats, Iron Maidens in the corner. But in reality, most medieval dungeons were just simple storage rooms or small underground chambers. They were often used as temporary holding cells, places to keep someone for a few days before trial or execution. Torture chambers as a common fixture? Unlikely. Most castles did not have dedicated torture rooms. When torture was used, it often happened in a specific legal context, with oversight, frequently within larger court buildings, not secret chambers beneath towers. Yes, some prisoners were treated cruelly. Yes, some conditions were grim. But the Hollywood version? The haunted house image? Largely fantasy. The myth of constant torture. It's easy to imagine that medieval justice was defined by torture, that every trial ended with broken bones or bloodshed. But the reality is more nuanced. In England, for example, torture was technically illegal. It was occasionally used in cases of treason or state security, but only with permission from the king or the Privy Council. Across much of Europe, torture was limited to serious offences and had to follow procedural rules. In many regions, multiple judges or clerics had to be present. Some states even required written approval before instruments could be used. More often, medieval justice relied on shame, public ritual, fines, and exile. Pain was only one tool among many. And it was not the most common. Why the myths persist? Why do we continue to believe in Iron Maidens and nightmare dungeons? Because fear is fascinating. The Renaissance and Enlightenment periods wanted to paint the Middle Ages as primitive. Writers exaggerated old punishments to make modern society appear more enlightened. The Victorians, obsessed with Gothic horror, added even more drama. They created museums of torture, wrote sensational novels, and fed the public's hunger for macabre imagery. And today, these myths persist in movies, video games, Halloween decorations. They entertain, they thrill, they give us the comforting illusion that we are more civilized. But in believing these myths, we miss the real story. The Middle Ages were not full of monsters, they were full of people, struggling to understand justice in a dangerous world. Sometimes they were brutal. But sometimes, they were careful, deliberate, even merciful. To flatten the era into a horror show is to do those people an injustice. What the real history teaches us, by stripping away the fiction, we begin to see the truth, that medieval justice was built on belief, religious, communal, symbolic. That pain was used sparingly, and often with specific legal frameworks. That shame, silence, and spectacle were just as powerful as blades or chains. That much of what we fear was never real, and what was real was deeply human. History is not a haunted house, it's a mirror, and in this mirror we see not demons but ancestors. They were imperfect, so are we, but when we remember them gently, we begin to understand not just their world, but ours. The soft dimming of a harsh era. All things end, even darkness. Tonight we walk slowly through the final days of the medieval system of punishment. Not with drama, but with softness. This is the quiet unraveling of a time when pain shaped law, when shame sculpted obedience, and when silence was justice's sharpest edge. The twilight of torture did not arrive with a revolution. It did not come as fire or fury. It came like a fading candle, flickering low, then lower, then out. Let's begin in the century, where everything began to change. The rise of New Thought. By the 1600s and 1700s, a new kind of light began to spread across Europe. It wasn't from torches or hearths, but from minds. This was the dawn of the Enlightenment. Writers, philosophers, and scholars began to question everything: monarchy, religion, education, and justice. They asked, what is punishment for? Is it meant to destroy, or to correct? Should pain teach? Or does it merely wound? Thinkers like John Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu began to reshape how people viewed crime and law. They argued for reason, for fairness, for dignity. But one voice rang loudest in the world of punishment. Cesare Beccaria, A Gentle Revolution. In 1764, an Italian philosopher named Cesare Beccaria published a small book on crimes and punishments. Its message was simple, but revolutionary. Beccaria wrote that punishment should never be cruel, that torture was ineffective and immoral, that the purpose of justice was to prevent crime, not to avenge it. He believed laws should be clear, trials fair, and punishments proportional. He argued, gently but firmly, that pain does not lead to truth, that confessions under torture are unreliable, that brutality creates silence, not honesty. His ideas spread quickly. Kings read them, courts adopted them, ordinary people repeated them, and with that, the walls began to crumble. The legal reforms begin in the years after Beccaria's writings. Country after country began to restrict or abolish torture. Prussia outlawed judicial torture in 1740 under Frederick the Great. Sweden followed in 1772. Austria, under the reformist Emperor Joseph II, banned it in 1776. France began removing torture from its legal system shortly before the French Revolution. Even Russia, under Catherine the Great, reformed many of its harshest punishments. In England, torture was already uncommon in the courts. While some physical punishments remained, like public flogging and branding, formal torture was seen as a foreign horror. Instead of pain, prisons began to rise. The birth of the prison system. The prison, in the Middle Ages, had been rare. A holding cell, a place to await trial, not the punishment itself. But in the Enlightenment era, that changed. Prisons became places of correction, of containment, of reform. Imagine a long corridor lined with doors. Behind each one, a single person. No stocks, no pillories, just silence and time. Some believed this was more humane. Others saw in it a new cruelty, one that replaced public pain with private despair. But either way, it was different. The spectacle was fading. Justice was retreating behind walls, no longer a street performance, but an institution. The end of public punishment. As prisons rose, public punishments declined. No more ducking stools in the square. No more iron bridles strapped to mouths. The stocks and pillories were slowly dismantled. Executions, once held in marketplaces, were moved behind walls. The age of communal shame ended. Now justice was managed by systems, not crowds. And while injustice still exists, it began to wear a different face. Why the shift happened? It wasn't just philosophy. The printing press made new ideas easier to share. Trade and urbanization made societies more diverse, requiring new systems of order. Secular governments began to take power from the church, leading to more standardized laws. And warfare and diplomacy required nations to appear civilized in the eyes of others. Torture became a symbol of backwardness, of cruelty, of failure. And so, it was hidden. Then removed. But not forgotten. Though torture faded from lawbooks, it remained in memory. It became legend, folklore, horror. Writers romanticized the dungeons, artists drew nightmare devices, museums displayed Iron Maidens that never were. The Middle Ages became a stage. Its punishments exaggerated, its systems misunderstood. Yet within those myths, something deeper lingered. A warning, a shadow, a truth too sharp to forget. The lingering echoes. Even today, we wrestle with justice. We still debate punishment, what it means, what it should achieve, what it costs. We still see systems that silence, that isolate, that perform. And so the twilight of torture is not just a moment in history. It is a question still flickering. What do we do with those who break the rules? How do we balance protection with compassion? When is justice justice, and when is it fear with a mask? The gentle lesson of history. By walking through the past gently, we learn to hold our own systems with care. The medieval world was not a nightmare, it was a mirror. And it shows us that even the darkest structures were built by people who believed, rightly or wrongly, that they were doing what was necessary. It reminds us that cruelty can be ordinary, that systems can feel fair to those inside them, that change takes time, and that every chain, every mask, every flame, eventually flickers out. Let us leave this era now. Let us step out of the dungeons. Let the doors creak closed behind us. The torches have burned low. The punishment has ended. Only the story remains. We have walked together through long corridors of shadowed stone, past courtrooms echoing with judgment, through market squares alive with murmurs and eyes, into quiet cells and imagined machines. We have stood beside the rack, not in terror, but in understanding. We have watched the stocks hold ordinary people still. We have listened to women's voices be silenced, and we have heard the whispers of those whose names were lost to time. And now, we are here, at the edge of the past, on the threshold of sleep. Let us pause and breathe. In and out. One more time. In and out. What we carry from the past. The story of medieval punishment is not one of monsters and madness. It is a story of people, flawed, faithful, afraid. A story of order and fear, of justice shaped by faith, by ritual, and by a deep desire to keep the world from unraveling. It was not gentle, but it was human. To remember it with softness is not to excuse it, it is to honor the people who lived through it. To see them not as shadows in cages, but as souls, struggling to survive in a world without the comforts we know. And to remember, too, that justice is never fixed. It evolves with us, changes with time. It can be reshaped, gently. The importance of stillness. Tonight, in the quiet moments just before rest, think of the woman walking home after public shame, shoulders squared. The man in the stocks, watching birds fly overhead. The child who saw the gallows but grew up to build a school instead. These are the quiet stories. The after stories. They are what remain when the fire is gone. And that's where you are now. In the after. In the calm. No more verdicts. No more chains. Just breath. Just stillness. You are safe. Letting the past rest. The torches that lit our journey are dimming now. The dungeon doors creak shut. The echoing corridors fall silent. Let the Iron Maiden remain a myth. Let the rack return to dust. Let the bridle hang quiet on a museum wall, never to be worn again. And let the people, those real breathing people, rest. Their stories are remembered. Their voices, softly heard. They do not need to suffer in your memory, they only need to be seen. A Final Whisper history is not here to frighten you. It is here to rock you gently. To show you how far we've come, and how far we still must go. Let the weight of it settle gently on your shoulders. Not heavy, but grounding. And let your mind float free. You are not in a cell. You are not on trial. You are not walking toward judgment. You are simply here, warm, safe, still. Sleep now, listener. The story is over. The punishments have passed. Justice has changed. And you are part of that change, because you cared enough to listen. So rest easy now, and let the past sleep.